Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what pulled you into this story. If it spoke to you, drop a comment. Your words help keep history's forgotten voices alive. Picture this: a castle crouched in the northern Hungarian hills. Its walls rise pale against a bruised sky, windows narrow as watchful eyes. Villagers in the valley below whisper about the lady who lives there, about how young girls go in but do not come out. Some say they hear screams at night, muffled by stone. Others tell of crimson stains in the snow outside the castle gates. They whisper her name with equal parts fear and awe, Elizabeth Báthory. History has painted her as the most prolific female serial killer of all time, the Blood Countess, a woman so obsessed with beauty and youth that she allegedly bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her own skin. 600 victims, some say, 600 lives drained at her command. It's the kind of story that fits neatly into a horror movie, a gothic castle, a powerful woman twisted by vanity, a tally of victims so staggering it borders on the supernatural. No wonder Elizabeth has been woven into vampire legends, standing beside Dracula as one of history's darkest monsters. But here's the twist. The truth is much murkier. Beneath the horror and legend lies a tale of power, wealth, and politics in a country torn apart by war. Because Elizabeth Báthory wasn't some isolated recluse. She was one of the most powerful women in Central Europe, and in the brutal chess game of noble families, that made her dangerous. So, what's real? Did Elizabeth truly torture and kill hundreds of women? Or was she smeared by men who envied her fortune and wanted her lands? Was she the monster or the perfect scapegoat? Tonight, we're walking into the shadow of her castle to find out. To understand Elizabeth, you have to understand the world that made her. The Hungary of the 1500s was not the quiet green countryside of modern postcards. It was a war zone carved up by empires and haunted by battles that left villages burned and fields salted. On one side loomed the Ottoman Empire, pressing westward after their conquest of Constantinople. On the other side were the Habsburgs, rulers of Austria and much of Central Europe. And caught in between was Hungary, a kingdom that had once been mighty but was now fractured, divided into shifting regions of loyalty and constant tension. This wasn't the romantic Europe of Renaissance paintings. This was frontier country where violence was a daily currency and noble families wielded power like private armies. Feuds between lords weren't petty arguments. They were battles fought with steel, fire, and blood. It was into this world that Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560. And she wasn't just anyone's daughter. She was born into the Báthory family, one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties in Hungary and Transylvania. Her relatives included kings, cardinals, and military commanders. Her cousin Stephen Báthory even became king of Poland. Power wasn't something Elizabeth stumbled into. It was her inheritance. From childhood, Elizabeth lived among wealth and influence. She was educated, remarkably so for a woman of her time. She spoke Latin, German, and Hungarian fluently. She studied philosophy and religion. This was not the stereotypical image of a hysterical noblewoman clutching charms in the dark. Elizabeth was intelligent, sharp, and politically aware, but she also grew up in a world where violence was normalized. Punishment for disobedience was harsh, executions were public, torture was part of legal proceedings. If Elizabeth later committed acts of cruelty, it wasn't because she invented them, it was because cruelty was already in the bloodstream of her society. By the age of 15, Elizabeth was married off to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a union that cemented alliances between two of Hungary's most powerful families. The wedding itself was extravagant, attended by nobility across the region, with gifts and land exchanged like chess pieces. Elizabeth brought a massive dowry. Ferenc gave her his castle, Chuktic, perched high on a hill, watching over the villages below like a hawk. Ferenc, known as the Black Knight of Hungary, was feared across the land for his brutality against the Ottomans. He was not a gentle husband, but his frequent absence, campaigning in endless wars, left Elizabeth in charge of their vast estates. This was unusual for the time. While other noblewomen played decorative roles, Elizabeth wielded real power. She managed lands, issued orders, punished servants, and kept the household running. And here's the detail worth underlining. Elizabeth was not just wealthy. She was autonomous. When Ferenc died young in 1604, Elizabeth became one of the richest widows in Europe, with holdings and influence that rivaled kings. Now, if you were a woman in the 1600s with money, independence, and brains, what did that make you? Admired? Hardly. It made you a target. The year is 1604. Count Ferenc Nadasti is dead, his body lowered into the cold earth after years of war. He was ruthless, infamous for impaling enemies on stakes outside his camp to frighten the Ottomans. His absence leaves a vacuum, and into that vacuum steps his widow, Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth is only 44 years old. She is wealthy beyond imagination, with castles, villages, and estates under her name. She commands hundreds of servants. Peasants bend their heads when she rides past. She is a woman of immense power in a man's world. And here is where whispers begin. At first, they're little things. Servant girls disappearing, rumors of punishments that go too far. In a time when nobles had absolute power over their households, beatings and harsh discipline were expected, but the whispers say Elizabeth's cruelty is different, more creative, more excessive. By 1609, the stories grow darker. Girls vanish after being summoned to the castle. Families grumble that their daughters, promised work, never come home. Some mutter about screams carried on the wind at night. Then come the first accusations of blood. The birth of the legend. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact moment Elizabeth Báthory became the Blood Countess. Some accounts suggest the legend began with a single accident. A servant girl brushed Elizabeth's hair too roughly, pulling a knot. Enraged, Elizabeth struck her so hard that blood splattered onto her hand. Later, she noticed her skin looked fresher where the blood had fallen. A seed of obsession, the story says, took root. Did this moment happen? Probably not. It reads like Gothic theatre, not courtroom fact. But legends grow on fertile ground, and Elizabeth, powerful, independent, intimidating, was the perfect soil. Soon she is accused not just of beating servants, but of killing them. Not just killing, but torturing. Not just torturing, but bathing in blood. Think about that for a moment. Bathing in blood. It's the kind of detail that sticks in the imagination. No one needs evidence once a rumor like that exists. All they need is one suspicious death, one body that looks too pale, and suddenly the pieces fit a horrifying puzzle. What were the crimes? The charges against Elizabeth were monstrous. Girls were lured to the castle under the promise of work, then chained, starved, or beaten. Needles were shoved under fingernails. Flesh was cut away. Lips were sewn together. Victims were burned with hot irons, doused in freezing water, left to die in the snow. And of course, the most infamous charge, that Elizabeth drained their blood to preserve her youth. Contemporary testimonies, collected decades later, claim that as many as 600 victims were murdered within her castle walls. But pause here, 600. That's more than Jack the Ripper, more than Bundy or Dahmer, or any modern serial killer combined. 600 girls vanished in a rural region, without mass graves, without clear records. That number is less history than mythology. So, where did it come from? The answer lies in Elizabeth's world. Remember, she was rich, independent, and a widow. That made her politically dangerous. Her land holdings were vast. Her debtors were many, including powerful nobles and even the King of Hungary himself. King Matthias II owed her money. If Elizabeth were found guilty of heinous crimes, her property could be seized and her debts erased. Convenient, isn't it? By 1610, the rumours had grown too loud to ignore, or too useful to suppress. The king ordered an investigation. Leading it was György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, a man with both political motive and personal ambition. He would be the one to take Elizabeth down. December 1610. Snow lies thick on the ground as Thurzó and his men ride toward Chaktic Castle. According to reports, they enter to find a grisly scene: half-dead girls chained to walls, corpses discarded in corners, and others writhing in agony. It sounds like the climax of a horror novel. But here's the catch. The only records we have of this raid come from Thurzo's men. No independent accounts survive. It is, in other words, a story written entirely by the victors. Elizabeth was arrested, not tried in a public court, but quietly confined in her own castle. Her alleged accomplices, servants who supposedly helped her, were interrogated under torture. Predictably, they confessed to everything. Torture always produces confessions. And those confessions sealed Elizabeth's fate in history. From here, the myth takes off. By the 18th century, when vampire lore swept through Europe, Elizabeth's story fused with the new monster of folklore. She wasn't just a killer, she was Dracula's female counterpart. Books painted her as a demon in silk gowns, draining virgins like a predator in the night. The image stuck. It was too perfect for Gothic fiction, a beautiful noblewoman in a castle, feeding on innocence to preserve her beauty. But if you peel away the horror, you find something else. Elizabeth Báthory may have been cruel. She may have been guilty of some violence. Most nobles were. But 600 victims, bathing in blood? Or was she a wealthy widow who made the wrong enemies and became the perfect target for a political takedown? That's the paradox. Elizabeth Báthory exists in two versions: the monster, sadistic, bloodthirsty, the archetype of the vampire countess; the scapegoat, a powerful woman destroyed by a patriarchal society that couldn't stomach her autonomy. Which is true, maybe both, maybe neither. But the fact that her story still chills us 400 years later tells you something. It isn't just about Elizabeth. It's about how history treats women who wield power outside the boundaries men allow. The year is 1611. Europe is cold, hard, and unforgiving, and in the icy halls of Hungarian power, Elizabeth Báthory's name is on every tongue. Not as a noble widow, not as the wealthiest woman in the kingdom, but as a monster. Her arrest in December had been sensational. Whispers spread through villages like frost that chained corpses were found at Chaktic, that the Countess herself was caught red-handed with victims still bleeding. The details grew darker with every telling. By the time the Palatine, Georgi Thurzo, presented his findings, Elizabeth was no longer merely accused, she was damned. But here's the uncomfortable truth: Elizabeth Báthory never stood trial. Ask yourself, if she really was guilty of murdering hundreds, wouldn't the courts have paraded her as proof of divine justice? Wouldn't her execution have been a grand spectacle? Instead, Elizabeth was locked away quietly in her castle, walled up in a set of rooms with only small slits for food and air. Why? Politics. Elizabeth was no ordinary criminal. She was a Báthory, a family name so powerful it stretched across Central Europe. Her relatives included princes of Transylvania, cardinals of the church, and even a king of Poland. To drag her before a court would risk scandal, retaliation, even civil war. So the solution was a compromise. Elizabeth would never walk free again, but she would never face a public trial. Instead, the punishment would fall on those beneath her, her servants. In January 1611, Elizabeth's alleged accomplices were tried in Bratislava. 4 of them, Dorothea, Ilona, János, and Katerina, were accused of aiding her in torture and murder. Their testimonies, extracted under torture, painted Elizabeth as a sadist who ordered, witnessed, and sometimes personally carried out atrocities. One servant claimed that Elizabeth stuck needles into girls' fingers. Another said she bit chunks of flesh from victims' faces. Still another spoke of freezing baths in winter, girls left naked to die in the snow. Under pain of the rack and branding irons, the stories became wilder, more grotesque, each one adding to the image of the blood countess. And the sentences, brutal. Dorothea and Ilona had their fingers torn out with hot pincers before being burned alive. János was beheaded, a mercy compared to the flames. Only Katerina, the youngest, was spared execution, sentenced instead to life in prison. The servants died screaming, their bodies consumed by fire. Elizabeth, meanwhile, sat walled up in her fortress, listening to the silence close around her. So what did the trial actually prove? The prosecution claimed that more than 300 witnesses testified against Elizabeth. Villagers, local officials, even priests came forward with stories. Some said they saw dead bodies carried from the castle. Others claimed they heard screams. A few recounted second-hand tales of blood rituals, but here's the thing. Most of these testimonies were hearsay, gossip, rumors repeated under oath. And in a world where torture was an acceptable investigative tool, truth and fabrication blurred. And then there's the body count. The official tally varies wildly. Some records claim dozens of deaths. Others inflate the number to 650, supposedly written in a private ledger. That ledger has never been found. 650 victims. It's a number that chills the imagination, but it also reeks of exaggeration. Enough to make Elizabeth the most prolific killer in human history, but with no physical evidence to support it. So what was it? Truth? Myth? Or a carefully crafted political hit job? To understand the trial, you have to look at what came after. Elizabeth's vast estates were placed under the control of her relatives. King Matthias II, who owed her a fortune in debts, suddenly no longer had to pay. Thurzo, the Palatine, rose in prestige as the man who had saved the kingdom from a demon in noble disguise. Convenient outcomes all around, except for Elizabeth. The woman who had once commanded power equal to kings was reduced to a ghost in her own castle. Elizabeth Báthory spent her last years confined in Countess, not executed, not publicly shamed, but erased. The rooms she was sealed into had bricked-up windows, save for tiny slits through which food was passed. Imagine it, the Countess of Hungary, who once dined on silver and velvet, now eating scraps in the dark. Some say she scratched at the walls until her nails broke. Some say she raved at invisible enemies. Others claim she wrote letters, still demanding her innocence, still railing against those who betrayed her. And then, on August 21st, 1614, her jailers found her dead. No drama, no spectacle, just an old woman lying in her bed, silenced at last. She was buried quietly, her remains eventually moved, because villagers feared her grave would bring curses. And so ended the life of the Blood Countess, or perhaps the life of a woman framed to be remembered as one. Elizabeth Báthory never got to speak in her own defense. Her voice was replaced by the screams of tortured servants, the whispers of enemies, and the ink of men eager to write her story for her. Was she a sadistic killer who bathed in blood, or a widow crushed under the weight of politics and rumor? Was she a vampire, a monster, or just a woman whose power threatened the wrong men at the wrong time? That ambiguity is what makes her legend so enduring. You can read the records, you can weigh the evidence, but in the end, you're left staring into the same abyss her jailers must have faced, the mystery of Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth Báthory is dead. Her rooms at Countess are sealed, her body lowered into the ground, her name cursed in hushed tones across Hungary. And yet, this is where her story truly begins, not in life, but in legend. Because if history is about facts, legend is about what people want to believe. In the decades after her death, stories of Elizabeth's crimes grew more lurid with every retelling. By the 18th century, Europe was gripped by vampire hysteria. Pamphlets and sermons warned of corpses rising from their graves to drink the blood of the living. Writers sought historical examples to feed the craze. Elizabeth Báthory, already infamous, slipped neatly into the role. The Blood Countess became a vampire queen, a female counterpart to the later legend of Dracula. While Vlad the Impaler was remembered for battlefield cruelty, Elizabeth's tale became something more intimate, more horrifying. She preyed not on armies, but on children and young women. And let's be honest, this is where the myth wins. A noble woman bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty. It's irresistible, it's grotesque, it's gothic, and it's unforgettable. Facts don't matter once you've painted that picture. But historians ask, how much of it was true? 600 victims, that number echoes in every account stamped like a death toll, but look closer. The source of that number, a single piece of testimony, allegedly a ledger kept by Elizabeth herself. Yet that ledger has never been found. And if it ever existed, why was it never produced in court? Modern scholars suspect the true number, if any, was far smaller, maybe dozens, maybe fewer. Enough to prove cruelty, yes, but not the legendary slaughter of hundreds. The truth may have been twisted, stretched, inflated, because the bigger the crime, the more justified the punishment. The deeper truth may be this: Elizabeth Báthory was guilty, but not of what history accuses. Her real crime? Being a powerful, wealthy, independent woman in the 17th century Hungary. She inherited vast estates, controlled wealth, and held authority in a society that resented female autonomy. Her cruelty toward servants, if real, was not unusual for nobles of the time. Brutality was part of the feudal system. But the combination of her gender, her fortune, and her enemies turned her into a perfect target. And once the accusations began, they didn't stop. What better way to destroy her than to brand her as inhuman, as a creature who literally fed on the young? By the 19th century, Elizabeth Báthory had crossed the line from history into horror. Poets and novelists invoked her as a cautionary tale. Painters depicted her as a pale, beautiful aristocrat with blood-red lips. Later, filmmakers gave her a cinematic afterlife. Hammer horror studios put her in corsets and candlelit castles. Modern movies and TV shows reinvent her as everything from a tragic anti-heroine to a demonic predator. Even music and fashion claim her. Metal bands sing of her. Perfume ads nod to her immortality. Costume designers drape models in gowns meant to suggest the vampire Countess. She has become in many ways a brand. The irony is sharp. The woman accused of bathing in blood to preserve her youth is now forever young in popular culture. Immortal not through murder, but through myth. So who was Elizabeth Báthory? A sadistic killer who butchered servant girls in her castle? A widow scapegoated by powerful men who wanted her wealth? Or a complicated mix of both? Cruel, yes, but also exaggerated into a monster for political convenience? We may never know for certain. The records are too tangled, too biased, too soaked in rumor. What we do know is that Elizabeth Báthory still has power, not over servants, not over villages, but over our imagination. And that perhaps is the most haunting legacy of all. So here's the question I leave you with. When we tell the story of Elizabeth Báthory, whose voice are we really hearing? Hers? Her victims? Or the voices of men who wrote her into history as a monster to erase her power? Because in the end, history is not just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell the story. And in Elizabeth's case, the storytellers may have been just as ruthless as the crimes they accused her of. As the shadows lengthen and the stars begin to whisper, we close the pages of this ancient tale. In the hush of night, truth rests where faith once stood strong. Sleep gently now, wrapped in the echoes of empires long gone. Until next time, when darkness falls and another lullaby of a fallen world begins.